Hello everyone, Ambassador Jordi, Gabriela. Today we mention Yom Hashoah, Holocaust and Heroism Remembrance Day. In this day, we commemorate the over 6 million Jews who were systematically murdered by Nazi Germany and their collaborators during World War II. The Holocaust was also the biggest manifesto of anti-Semitism in recent history. For decades, Holocaust survival testimonies have been the centerpiece in teaching the lessons and stories of the Holocaust to the young generations. Now, with more and more Holocaust survivors passed away, we need to find new and engaging way to tell these stories in a way that will be still relevant for today. To try and answer these questions, we are meeting today for an intimate conversation at the living room of Ambassador Plotzerkowski, the Ambassador of Israel in South Africa, together with Jordi Stank and Gabriela Bloomberg, to see how we can find a link between the past and the future through storytelling. So we have Ambassador Plotzerkowski, Ambassador to the Embassy of Israel in South Africa. Jordi and Gabriela, if you may introduce yourselves.
Hi, I'm Jordi Sank, and I'm the director of I Am Here, the documentary film that documents the life of a remarkable Holocaust survivor, Ella Blumenthal.
And I'm Gabriela Bloomberg. I'm the producer of I Am Here.
All right. So Jordi and Gabriela are here today because one of the things they've done is find a unique and powerful way to share the story of Ella, a South African Holocaust survivor. And as you mentioned in the trailer to the movie, Ella is not your average 98 years old Holocaust survivor woman. So maybe you can share a little bit about the movie?
Yes, I think for us it was so important to capture Ella's incredible spirit. She'd been through so much and so much trauma in the Holocaust, and I think what's really resonated with people around the world is Ella's incredible spirit and how she's able to tell her story and to be able to look to a bright, beautiful future. And she doesn't harbor resentment. She wants to preach a message of love and understanding, so that ultimately the Holocaust or atrocities like it should never happen again, and that the world can live in a state of harmony, peace, love and understanding. So it's just been incredible to see Ella's message, and for sort of everyone around the world to be bitten by this bug of loving this 98-year-old Holocaust survivor and really just deeply understanding what she went through, and sort of learning about the Holocaust through her.
Yeah, I agree with you. Maybe we can see the trailer now for our audience to understand a little bit about what Ella is all about.
I love to talk to people. I love to meet people. Whoever told you that I am old? Look at me. But I try to never talk about my suffering and fight for survival.
Hate crimes are on the rise.
I was born in Warsaw. I was a happy teenager until the Nazis invaded Poland. I lost almost my entire family. Just my niece Roma left. We were sent to terrible places. We are condemned to death. I never lost hope. I was not ready to die.
Would any of us reach out with love to the very person who denies your own history?
There was always an undercurrent of something going on.
I am very thankful to you. You helped me to live.
we should not forget. Why was I chosen to survive? I'm standing here among all of you. Tell me that it's me. It's me.
Gabriela, what inspired you when you decided to choose Ella as the main hero of your movie?
Geordie grew up with Ella, and this was the first project that we worked on together. And when he told me about Ella, he didn't tell me this is a woman who has survived 3 concentration camps and grew up in the ghetto, and this is her story. He said, you know, this is a woman of boundless energy, enthusiasm, positivity, and we try to also do that in the film, is frame her and her personality first, and I think that's what gives audiences access to learning about the Holocaust. It's because of Ella, and the film wouldn't be the same if we had focused on a different person, because Ella is the film. It's her message, it's her energy, and the film allows audiences to meet her, and it's because of really as it's her positivity. She didn't just overcome trauma. She's done it with dignity, but looking forward to the future. And it's something I think that all of us can learn from in any hardships that we're experiencing, or is the way that Ella appreciates each day, and that's why we chose to focus on her.
So I understand from what you're saying, as part of what you're saying, it was important for you to focus on someone and on some things that could be relevant to people who watch Ella today. We say that even people today who struggle with different situations can take from what she experienced and think of how they behave in certain situations.
Definitely, and I think also South Africa, you know, we have a very, you know, we're still a country that's very new to democracy, and our history is very traumatic and tainted. So I think people, you know, we've been very surprised for a South African audience who watch the film, who either went through the apartheid system or who felt the effects from their parents or grandparents who went through the apartheid system. You know, they resonate with Ella being able to overcome these traumas, and to, you know, they sort of take a page from her book of her incredible outlook on life. So that's been really incredible to see from a local South African context for us.
And I think on top of that, using the film to speak not only about the Holocaust, but about all forms of discrimination and othering, and how the Holocaust was what happens when discrimination is taken to the extreme, in a similar way to apartheid, when discrimination is actually put in legislature. And so I think it's a reminder to each of us every day as individuals, how do we behave when we encounter someone that's different to us, and Ella's a shining example of that. So we hope that through storytelling we can actually begin these conversations about all forms of othering.
Ambassador, speak about a Holocaust, obviously something that happened such a long time ago, and there are many lessons we can learn from the Holocaust, but what do you think are the main lessons that are relevant today that we can take and use when we educate, or when we show the Holocaust, when we try to teach about the Holocaust, the young generation, specifically non-Jewish generation?
Yeah, well, I think first the Holocaust obviously is it was probably one of the most, or probably the most terrible event in human history. And usually people, they try to get away from atrocities or all sort of events that are particularly heavy and they try to protect themselves from it. And in this, there is it's a huge challenge of teaching about the Holocaust or the lessons of the Holocaust, because people, they don't really want to deal with this. It's too heavy, and actually you can understand wars, you can understand natural calamities. The Holocaust is something that you cannot understand. Mm-hmm. And if you cannot understand it, you try to get away from it, because why should you bother? It's impossible to understand how one nation systematically devised a way to exterminate another. It's impossible to understand. So I think in that, from that angle, it's very difficult to teach, particularly the young generation, which is usually very optimistic, and why should we bother? It happened a long time ago, etc., etc. I think one of the greatness of the movie you made it from a very optimistic angle, and people want to connect to it. People want to connect to people that are optimistic. It kind of passes the energy to the viewers, you know. And if Ella managed to get out of this hell, because it was hell, optimistic, having no resentment, but on the contrary, moving forward and dynamic and so on, this is something that attracts a lot of people. And this could be an excellent way to talk about Holocaust as well, because that's what she passed through. So from that angle, I think this movie is really very, very important, much more than talking about specifically Ella. It's just a great way, I think, to talk about Holocaust in general. And again, I think as we move forward and as survivors are leaving us, it's going to be more and more difficult. More and more difficult. So.
Yeah, that's a very good point. It is obvious in the movie about Ella. So it brings me to my next question. What is the angle, apart from what the ambassador has mentioned, that you've decided to take in the movie to make it more engaging, more accessible, as opposed to what you didn't choose to do?
I think a big step for us was, and it came, we went and we filmed with Ella initially, and then when we were going through her testimony, we started to look at the black and white stock footage, and what we soon realized was that the black and white stock footage, it wasn't resonating with the way that she tells her story. She tells them so vividly, and she describes them, and you actually just feel like you're there with her when she speaks. And the black and white stock footage was just so, it made it feel so distant. So I think a big thing for us was discovering the animation that landed up being used in the film, because it allows you as an audience member to walk alongside Ella, to go on this journey with Ella, and through that and through empathizing with her character on this journey, you're able to understand in a very, very deep, personal, intimate way what she experienced. So I think that's also been incredible, because it's connected to a much younger audience and generation, which it's so important for them to carry the baton of Holocaust memory, and as Holocaust survivors start to perish now, they will be the ones who really carry the memory of the Holocaust going forward. So it's so important to appeal to the younger generations.
Though I have to say that it's not only appealing for the younger generation, but I think to the general public. And I can compare it to a movie that has been done in Israel in the 80s about the first Lebanese war. That was the first, I think, movie in Israel that was done. It was the whole movie was animation, but it dealt with very, very tough issues. And somehow through this media of animation, it could be
palatable.
More accessible. The experience was more accessible to the general public that perhaps did not experience the war and the traumas that are related to it.
Yeah, I think as Jory's mentioning the stock footage, and it's what you're saying too, that the stock footage sometimes can be quite alienating, black and white, or it could also be a bit too visceral and a bit off-putting, seeing very strong images. So I think the animation
makes it soft a little bit.
It does make it a bit more palatable, but it also allows us to not just walk alongside Ella in spaces where there might have been stock footage, but to get into her spirit. For example, there's a scene of her finding a piece of a Haggadah in one of the camps, and she is enveloped by the Hebrew words and she flies in the sky, and being able to get into her emotional headspace.
It's almost like being there when experiencing what she has experienced.
Exactly, and that's what animation, allowed us to do. And I think another thing that we did differently to what one would imagine seeing in a Holocaust documentary is we didn't have any what's known as talking heads, which is when somebody sits down and gets interviewed, and there's also an expert who gets interviewed, and then it cuts to the footage of the film. What we did is the camera was almost a fly on the wall as Ella recounted her story to very intimate people in her life, to her family, to her grandchildren. And I think this gives the audience a very... They enter into a very vulnerable and intimate space, and they're able to really hear Ella's story and feel like they're there with her, which was important for us because, as you mentioned earlier, there was a need straight after the Holocaust for testimonies where people recorded facts and what happened. And here was using, as you mentioned, the storytelling to speak about the facts, but through a person, and that's where we thought that we didn't need the talking heads to carry the film.
I agree. I want to go back to the storytelling part. And Gabriela, you've mentioned on your bio that one of your passions is focus and write compelling stories for individuals. And from that place, I would like to hear from you a little bit about what do you think comprise a good story? When you think about how we build the stories, what do you think are the main keys for that?
I think, as you mentioned, I've always been drawn to creating films that, like this one, will become a catalyst for important conversations and themes and topics, or that will bring to light an issue or something that's happening in society. And when, especially with this film, which is a documentary, there is something intuitive about knowing that this is not just a good story, but has a good character, and through that character we can access, we can access a world of knowledge and history, and can start those conversations. But it's always, looking at stories, it is always about the character and about what they overcome, and generally there's what we call a character arc, how they'll start in one place and there'll be an event that happens and they have to grow to and change. And that's often what we speak about in fictional stories when one's writing something on a blank piece of paper. But a lot of my work is in the documentary space. I also work a lot with the Breast Health Foundation. So I often am working with real people and characters, and that character development that we speak about when we're writing a fictional story, you also find that in the real world, and it's what each of us go through on a daily basis. None of us are perfect, we all have our flaws, but how do we overcome obstacles and hopefully become better people? I mean, and Ella is just the penultimate example of someone who went through one of the most horrific periods in human history and came out not just alive, but with positivity, and with her faith, which is also something that is quite remarkable, that not all survivors hold so dear. her sense of family, her love for family, her love of being part of a community, and the bravery that she has to share her story. So I think it's those aspects that whatever I'm working on, if you've got a good character, then you've got a good story.
Yes, I could relate to that, Gabriella, because I think this is something that many Holocaust survivors have in common. For me, as a third generation of Holocaust survivors, I could see the optimism that my grandpa passed away, he had in his life. And every time he shared his story, there was always this positive aspect of how we look at the future and the family that he built. And always this story about the bravery and survival. And again, I think now that, like you mentioned, Jordi, a lot of the Holocaust survivors perished and the next generations stay behind. There's always the question, how do you still continue to share this optimism and share this feeling of success, like personal success, like I persevered, which is something that your great-great-great-parents felt, but how do you take it and work with it to share the story of the person, that it's not just technical? How do you bring the emotions into that and that feeling of the person?
I would like to mention on this something. I think in Israel we had a period, quite a long period, in which we formed the Israeli identity, and people who came from Europe, be it Holocaust survivors or others, had to blend in, and they had to turn themselves into Israelis, which is like a strong nation with strong army, etc., etc. At that period, Israel was kind of in the middle of forming its own national identity that was also based a lot on kind of heroic narratives, and the story of the Holocaust didn't really fit in. So the survivors were not really talking about it. People didn't want to talk about it. They wanted to blend, to forget Europe, to forget the trauma they went through. And I think now, the last years, maybe 10 or 15 years, Israel has become more mature, it's kind of more confident in itself, also to encompass those stories that were very traumatic. Many of them were not heroic. It was just killing of our people and so on. And people started to open up a bit and talk about it. And it's true that we had Yad Vashem that was dealing with it throughout ever since the State of Israel has been established. But the general public was not really into this kind of discussions. And now it's more popular. I mean, now again, it's like the last maybe 15 years or maybe even a bit more. It's becoming a subject of interest for the people, and people are talking about it. People are discussing. There is a second generation of Holocaust survivors. There is a third generation of Holocaust survivors, and they sort of try to find common characteristics because it's like it's kind of a part of the trauma that passed through generations, which is also a very interesting psychological phenomenon that is worth talking about.
It is. I think you're right, because I experienced the Holocaust differently from my grandpa as my parents did, as my dad did. Actually, I heard more stories than my dad did, because like you've mentioned, Ambassador, my grandpa only started speaking about this topic and what he experienced when he was around 40 years old. And he was more confident, like he came to my school to speak about it. But now if I want to go to a school or to speak to an audience about him and his life, I really need to carefully think what are the things that I want to emphasize and bring to the audience. What do you think about that, Jordi?
I think it's so true, and I think something, you know, in Gabi and I taking the film and speaking to different people in Israel, we came across an amazing organization called, I'm sure you know, Zikaron Basalon, and I thought it was just such a brilliant initiative to have very intimate conversations, you know, with family, with friends, in your home, about these hard topics of the Holocaust. So I think there's such a need for people to, like yourself, a third generation survivor, to go to schools and to speak and to tell the stories of survival that their grandparents told them. But I also think for all of us to open up our homes and to really, you know, educate our youth and, you know, everyone about what happened, and to really just deal very intimately with the hard conversations, like the ambassador mentioned earlier, about what the bystanders, and, you know, and how do we as a people also going forward, how do we sort of check our own humanity and you know, pave a better future.
Exactly.
And we see that with Ella too in the film. You know, she speaks about when she got married, her husband's family pressurized her to remove her tattoo. And I mean, she was coming to South Africa to start a new life, and he knew that she was a survivor, but she didn't tell her children. And they found out slowly. They would hear her screaming in the middle of the night. They would hear her nightmares. And slowly she opened up, and the way she says that, she says her scars healed. And I always think about the scar of the tattoo being removed, healing, and her emotional scars healing, to a point where she could speak about it. And I think a similar experience that her grandchildren probably discussed a lot more with her than their parents did. And it was interesting that the weekend that we filmed, it was her 98th birthday, where her children and grandchildren just asked her any question, and they said to us it actually was quite a cathartic experience for them, because where they had spoken to her about it, and in more recent years hear her speak at schools and at events, it was a very concentrated time of them really delving deep into all the experiences, which for us, we're very grateful to the family to allow us into such an intimate space. We were there, you know, with the camera and now showing the film around the world. So we're really indebted to the family for letting us into that space. And you know, Ella says in the film, she says, "Why did I survive? Why was it me?" And part of the almost justification that she gives is that she's was able to bring this unbelievable family into the world, and now from one survivor there's now multiple generations. So
and that's what is the name of the movie all about. I Am Here is what you created. The members of your family that will continue your legacy for the next generations, and also will share the stories.
One of the points that the Nazis tried to do, that they didn't only try to exterminate the Jewish people, but they also tried to exterminate the memory of them. You know, they tried to destroy all the documents, they tried to burn the bodies, they tried to... And the victory is not only in the survival of the Jewish people, but in the survival of the memory of what has happened. And this is a great victory, and I think it you know, leaves us with a lot of food for thought of how should we keep this memory on and moving to the next generation, as we spoke about.
Yeah, storytelling is a meaningful part of a way to do it. And I was just thinking that also through the generations, the messages change. Because the messages that my dad felt, he got out of his experience with his dad, are different in Ella's case, now that she's so optimistic and bright, has a positive thought about the future. I'm sure it's something that took time. She had to go through a process. and through the generations and the story we tell, the messages change. So I'm just wondering, what will be the messages of the generations to come? Will they stay the same or change? Probably not, but it's part of the process.
It's also interesting because Ella moved to a country that was not, there were troops, South African troops, that were fighting against the Nazis, but the country itself was not in the war really, and didn't experience it. So it was a completely different environment in which she kind of came with the story that most of the people could not really connect to, and she still managed to convey this, which is quite an achievement, I think.
So if there's one message you would like to share during our panel today about the topic we discussed, what will be it about the link between the past and the current events, and how we can teach the next generation about the Holocaust using storytelling?
You want to go first?
Sure. I don't know if this is really answering your question, but a wonderful behind-the-scenes story of Ella. We filmed her. There's a beautiful shot of her swimming in the swimming pool in Cape Town, and you see
I remember that.
the harbour behind her, and it's just we use that footage over when she's actually speaking about bathing for the first time after the war. And it's a scene really showing just her resilience and her strength. But a wonderful thing that happened when we were filming is Geordie said to her, she was 98 at the time, she's now, thank God, 100 years old. And Geordie said, we're going to go really slowly. We've got a 98-year-old woman swimming in the swimming pool. So, and he kind of blamed it on the camera. He said, we'll do one shot and then you can stop, and then we'll change the camera angle and you do another one. And she just said nonsense, and she strode down the steps of the pool, and she just swam 10 laps backwards and forwards. Amazing. And the camera nearly fell in, and everyone who was pushing the camera had to try and catch this camera from chasing this 98-year-old woman in a swimming pool. And for me, that message was just, not only did she show this resilience when it really mattered most, surviving in the Holocaust, but she shows that strength and that energy. She puts it towards whatever she's doing in that. She does it with full energy and full positivity. And for me, that's the message of every day, whatever I'm doing, thinking, how can I add the energy into whatever task it is that I'm doing? And she also adds that energy into, as Geordie mentioned, taking the time when she meets someone who's different, taking the time to hear their side of the story. And it's taking that time to speak to someone who's different to you. If we could all do that, there would be so much more understanding in the world. So I think it's why we made this film, was to let people meet that positivity of Ella, that resilience that she has, her message of love and understanding. And it's through telling her story that then we can have these conversations about the Holocaust, about a period of history, about the facts. And we can only have that through accessing Ella in her story.
Thank you for that.
Yeah, I think for me, I think meeting Ella has been one of the most life-changing things in my life, and it's honestly been a privilege to build such a beautiful relationship with Ella and to be able to hear her stories. And for me, growing up, going to a Jewish day school, learning about the Holocaust in the textbook, going to Poland on a Poland trip, I sort of processed what the Holocaust was, but and for a few days maybe it affects you, but I don't think I truly understood or sort of felt the gravitas of it until I sat with Ella, spoke with Ella, and started working on the film. And I really think, and I implore, the generations that aren't going to be so lucky to engage and to speak to a Holocaust survivor, I really think it's so important for them to find the personal stories. Pick a name, do research on one person that went through, the Holocaust and connect to that person. I think it's just so important for us each to find a way, a sort of a segue into understanding and empathizing with what happened within the context of the Holocaust. And I'm so sad that not everyone can get to meet the remarkable Ella Blumenthal, and I just hope that the film is accessible and there for anyone that wants to try and understand and to listen to the messages that Ella so wonderfully gives over in the film.
Yeah, so from my point of view, I would say that the Holocaust is obviously has universal messages. Now, if you take the Jewish people, who were the main victims, they learn about the Holocaust. They have probably mostly relatives or had relatives that have gone through. If they research a little bit the story of their family, they will find connections to the Holocaust. So I think it's the lessons of the Holocaust. I think they are, I won't say they are not for the Jewish people, but they are as well, but they are mostly for the other people that didn't go through this terrible historic trauma. And I think the real challenge for us is to see how we can convey the universal messages of the Holocaust also to other nations.
Yes.
Nations that gone through the Second World War in Europe, or nations that did not go, like South Africa. But because the message is universal, it has a lot of value for the whole humanity. But again, time goes by and it becomes gradually, we are risking the fact that it will become another historical event, which it's not. And the question is how we can keep it, and definitely your documentary, I think, is one of the important tools, because it received a very high acclaim basically everywhere, not only in Israel or not only among the Jewish communities, etc. So we need to find more ways to see how we can spread the message, what Holocaust teaches also to others.
So you spoke a lot about the different generations and what we learn from generations before us, and I think sometimes we see characteristics of, say, our grandparents and wonder why do they act like that. And a typical characteristic or kind of idiosyncrasy of that generation is the frugality, the way that, Ella uses one tea bag for 5 cups of tea. And so through the film, we tried to link it to why did she act like that. So then we showed a scene in animation where she was trying to take just a scrap of potato. And I think it's those links that remind us in our day-to-day when we encounter, whether it's our grandparents or anyone that has something that we might think is a strange habit, to think, where did these things come from? So I just think with Ella, it's so interesting we had that opportunity in the film to go backwards and forwards in time to see where she got these personality kind of traits.
Yes, this is also part of understanding the person. And if you understand the person better, maybe you can understand the situation better.
Exactly.
Maybe you can put yourself in his shoes. So I think it's a very important part of telling the story, making the other side understand better. So Ambassador, Jody, Gabriela, it was a pleasure having you here. I hope that after today we have a bit more understanding about how compelling stories are being told and how we can link that to the remembrance of the Holocaust and learn from that to teach and share the stories of the Holocaust survivors with the future generations. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all.